Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we're headed to Taiwan, specifically the Tamsui River.
But get this, we're exploring it through the lens of a children's book.
You heard right, a children's book. You guys sent in a recording of a presentation and Q&A about it.
Yeah, and it uses kayaking adventures to teach about the river's history and ecology. We'll see what makes it so effective.
And what insights it holds, even if you're, well, not a kid anymore.
Right, because there's a lot to unpack here.
Okay, so first things first. Our main source material is this audio recording.
It features two university professors.
Professor Chen, who's a water sports expert.
And Professor Min, specializing in children's literature.
And it seems Professor Chen's passion for the Tamsui River really kicked this whole thing off.
He actually started weaving local history and ecology into his water sports courses.
Wow, so it wasn't some random academic project.
And that eventually led to this book.
So it comes from a genuine place, a desire to share his love for the river.
And what better way than a children's story?
Totally. So tell me about this book. Who are the main characters?
Okay, so we have Tamsui, a very knowledgeable cat.
A cat, huh? Interesting choice.
And then there's Canoe, a girl who is super enthusiastic about the river, but also a bit clueless at first.
Ah, I see. The classic dynamic duo, the expert and the eager learner.
Exactly. And they go on these kayaking adventures down the river.
Encountering different landmarks and ecological hotspots along the way, it's like a treasure hunt.
Some of the key spots they visit are the Tamsui Old Street.
I've heard of that. It's supposed to be super bustling.
Then there's the historical Fort Santo Domingo.
Oh, wow. So history is woven in, too.
And the Guandu Nature Reserve, famous for its diverse bird species.
So they really cover a lot of ground.
They do. And it's all presented in this engaging way.
But I am curious, why a cat specifically for the Tamsui part? Did the creators say anything about that?
They did. Professor Min chose a stray cat because they are so independent.
Ah, I see. Like they go wherever they please. Makes sense.
And because of their connection to the urban environment.
So Tamsui knows the river intimately, like a local.
Exactly. He's like a wise old soul who's seen it all.
And then you have Canoe, the enthusiastic girl. Why choose a character who's initially clueless?
Well, Professor Min explained that Canoe represents the target audience. Children who might be new to the Tamsui River.
Right, so she's like a stand-in for the reader, asking the questions they might have.
And experiencing the river's wonders for the first time.
So Tamsui gets to be the teacher, explaining everything along the way.
Exactly. And not just about history and ecology, but also safety tips.
Oh yeah, I remember Professor Chen really emphasized those tide tables.
He even shared that story about a student who got stuck on a sandbar.
Oof, had to wait for the tide to come back in.
Right. It highlights the importance of being prepared.
And respecting nature. But hold on, why are tide tables so important on a river? Do they work differently than on the coast?
That's a great question, and it's something the book addresses. See, tides on a river are influenced by both the ocean tides and the river's own flow.
Ah, okay, so it's a bit more complex than just the ocean's pull.
Exactly. And the Tamsui is particularly susceptible to big changes in water level because it's a tidal estuary. It's where the river meets the sea.
Oh, so during low tide, it can get shallow very quickly.
Yeah, catching unsuspecting kayakers off guard.
That makes sense. It's not something you'd think about if you were kayaking on a lake, for example.
Right. So the book is subtly teaching these real-world lessons.
About safety and responsibility. It's more than just pointing out the pretty stuff.
Absolutely. And they go even further with this, even in something as simple as clothing choices.
What do you mean by that? Clothes.
Well, Professor Min mentioned that they carefully selected the colors of the characters' clothing to complement the life jackets.
Whoa, so it's not just about looking good, it's visual reinforcement of safety.
Exactly. They thought of everything.
Pretty smart. What else did they consider when creating the visuals?
Well, they wanted to capture the essence of the locations.
Like the Guandu Bridge, for example.
Yes. And they wanted to evoke that feeling of actually being there.
On the river, experiencing those landmarks from a kayaker's perspective.
Precisely.
I bet that took a lot of collaboration between Professor Min, the illustrator, and Professor Chen.
Oh, for sure. Professor Chen's firsthand knowledge must have been invaluable.
Did they mention any specific techniques they used?
Well, they visited each location multiple times, taking photographs, making sketches. They wanted to make sure the illustrations were accurate, but also engaging.
So it's not just about recreating a photo, it's about creating a visual narrative.
Exactly. And speaking of narrative, let's talk about the language used in the book.
Yeah, how did they explain those complex concepts like tides and ecosystems to young kids?
Professor Min said it was definitely challenging.
Yeah, finding that sweet spot between accuracy and simplicity is tough.
Right. You can't be too technical, but you also can't dumb things down.
So what did they do?
They focused on clear, concise language, avoiding jargon.
Okay, so keeping it straightforward.
And they used a lot of analogies and relatable metaphors.
I like that. It makes it easier to grasp those tougher concepts.
Exactly. Like instead of saying tidal forces, they might describe the tides as the ocean breathing.
Ah, I see. Much more relatable, especially for kids.
Right. They also wanted to make the language engaging.
So not just simple, but captivating too.
Exactly. They used a lot of active voice and sensory details to make the story come to life.
So instead of the air was salty, it's the tang of salt spray on their faces.
Precisely. Appealing to the senses makes it much more immersive.
Wow, this is already so insightful. It's clear this book is more than just a cute kayaking story.
It's carefully crafted to teach about the Danshui River on multiple levels.
And it sounds like there's a lot more to uncover.
We've only just scratched the surface.
So much more to explore. Stay tuned as we paddle further into the world of the Danshui River.
So, in the Q&A, someone asked about who this book is really for.
Oh, like the target audience.
Yeah. Like, is it just for elementary school kids or what?
That's a good question. It could appeal to wider audience, right? What did the creators say about that?
Well, Professor Min said they started with elementary school children in mind.
Oh, yeah, makes sense.
Especially those in higher grades. But they quickly realized it worked for a much broader audience.
I can see that. I mean, the themes are pretty universal. Curiosity, discovery,
Plus, who doesn't love a good adventure story?
Right. Exactly.
And Professor Min actually brought up this trend of cross-generational picture books. Books meant to be enjoyed by people of all ages.
Interesting. So even though it's a children's book, adults can still get something out of it.
Exactly. She sees this book fitting into that category.
Very cool. What other questions came up in the Q&A?
Someone had a question about kayaking on the Damshui, like more practical stuff.
Oh, interesting. What kind of practical stuff?
They were curious about permits and permissions. Do you need anything special to kayak there?
That's a good point. Makes sense they'd address that. What do they say?
Professor Chen went into the rules and regulations for water sports on the Danshui.
Makes sense.
And he said that permits are required for some things like filming documentaries.
Okay.
But for recreational kayaking in certain areas, you generally don't need a permit.
That's good to know. So you can just grab a kayak and go, pretty much.
Well, not so fast.
Oh, right.
He emphasized those tide tables again, haha.
Of course, safety first.
And he mentioned being aware of potential hazards, like strong currents.
Makes sense. Nature can be unpredictable.
Oh, and those sandbars we talked about.
Right. It's all about being prepared. Speaking of which, I have a question about those specific places the book mentions.
Okay.
Like, if you were actually following the character's journey in real life, could you stop and visit those places?
I see what you mean. That's a good question. And someone in the audience actually asked something similar.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were specifically curious about places to dock along the river, like near the Guandu Temple.
Oh, I see. So, like, if you're out kayaking and you see this beautiful temple, you'd want to stop and check it out up close.
Right.
Makes sense.
And Professor Chen said there are designated spots where you can dock safely and go ashore.
Okay, good. So it's possible.
But he cautioned against tying kayaks directly to the Guandu Temple Pier. It's mainly used by fishing boats.
Right. You don't want to get in the way of people working.
Exactly.
Did he have any suggestions for alternatives?
He recommended a nearby fire station pier specifically designed for recreational boaters.
Ah, perfect. So you can still visit the temple, but you're not disrupting things?
Exactly. You get to experience both the cultural and natural sides of the river.
I love that they thought of that. Blending practicality with the storytelling. It's not just showing you the beauty, it's giving you the info you need to actually explore it.
It's like they anticipated the questions someone might have if they were using the book as a real-life guide.
Exactly. Speaking of practical applications, did anything else interesting come up in the Q&A?
Oh yeah, at the very end, a listener had this idea that I thought was super cool.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What was it?
So they were inspired by the book's format, how easy it is to understand, and they suggested that it could be turned into a hands-on workshop.
A workshop? Like what kind of workshop?
They imagine people creating their own personalized versions of the book.
Wow, that's actually a fantastic idea, taking the engagement to a whole new level.
Right.
What was the reaction to that suggestion?
Both Professor Min and Professor Chen loved it.
Oh, I bet. That's amazing.
Professor Min even offered to lend her expertise.
So, like, she could guide the storytelling and illustration aspect.
Yeah, and then Professor Chen could bring in the knowledge of the river.
It would be an incredible way to get people even more invested in the Danshui.
Imagine the impact. Empowering people to create their own stories and illustrations inspired by the river.
It's incredible how a simple children's book can spark so much creativity.
It's not just about reading, it's about inspiring action and connection.
Okay, so we've talked about the book's intended audience, its practical applications, even the possibility of workshops. What else can we learn from this presentation?
Let's zoom in on the characters themselves for a minute.
Okay, yeah.
Danzai the cat and Shui the girl.
Right. What can we learn from how they brought these characters to life?
Well, I'm curious about the choice of a cat and a young girl.
Yeah.
There must be some deeper meaning there.
Professor Min talked about this. She explained that choosing a cat, specifically a stray cat, was deliberate.
Okay.
It reflects that independent nature, how adaptable they are.
I see. Makes sense.
And their connection to the urban environment.
Ah, right. Like they're at home in the city.
So Danzai isn't just any cat. He represents a certain connection to the river, like he's part of Tamsui.
And then you have Shui, who's initially clueless about the river. Why that choice?
Professor Min said Shui perfectly represents the target audience, those children who are new to the Danshui River.
Ah, okay, so they're learning alongside her. And because she doesn't know much, Danzai gets to step in as the guide.
That makes sense. It's a classic storytelling technique. You've got the experienced mentor and the eager student.
Exactly. It's a natural dynamic for learning. And Professor Min emphasized balancing factual information with those moments of fun and engagement.
Right. It can't be all facts and figures.
And that's where the personalities and interactions of the characters come in.
It's all starting to come together now. The setting, the characters, the illustrations. It creates this immersive learning experience.
And that's the beauty of it. They took a complex subject, this river's ecosystem, and made it accessible for kids without sacrificing accuracy.
Did they give any examples of how they simplified those scientific concepts? Like explaining tides or currents to someone who's never seen the ocean?
Professor Min mentioned they relied heavily on analogies.
Okay, so like comparing it to something familiar.
Yeah. For example, instead of using a term like tidal forces, they might describe the tides as the ocean breathing in and out.
Oh, I love that. It's accurate, but also makes sense to a kid. Did they use similar techniques for the river's ecosystem?
Absolutely. Instead of diving into all the scientific terminology, they focused on visuals, striking examples.
So instead of talking about biodiversity, they might show a heron catching a fish.
Exactly. Concrete examples to illustrate the interconnectedness of life.
This deep dive has already uncovered so much. It's fascinating to see how they approach making these complex topics accessible.
And we're not done yet. There's still more to unpack.
I can't wait to see what other gems we dig up as we continue exploring this project.
Let's shift our focus back to the visuals. We were talking about those challenges of capturing locations like the Guandu Bridge.
Oh, right.
But what about the action, the kayaking itself?
I was wondering about that too. It's one thing to draw a kayak, but how do you show the movement, the feeling of paddling?
Professor Min talked about that. Visual storytelling was super important to them.
Yeah.
They didn't want just static images.
Right. You want to feel the effort, the motion.
They wanted to bring that action to life, make you feel like you're in the kayak, experiencing it.
I bet that was tricky to do in a still image.
They didn't go into too much detail about the techniques, but Professor Min did say the illustrators worked closely with Professor Chen.
Oh, that makes sense. So they were drawing from real-life observation and experience.
They wanted to be accurate while still maintaining that childlike wonder.
That's a cool balance to strike. Did they say anything about the challenges of showing specific kayaking techniques or how the kayak moves on the water?
That's a great question, and it makes me think about something else Professor Chen mentioned, about adapting the techniques for children.
Wait, adapting techniques? Don't you just, paddle?
That's what I thought. But Professor Chen explained that children, they have different physical abilities than adults.
Oh, that makes sense. So they needed techniques that were safe and effective for younger kayakers.
Exactly. And they actually documented these new techniques. Professor Chen said they even photographed them from different angles.
Wow, so much attention to detail. They're not just telling a story, they're creating this resource for anyone who wants to learn about kayaking.
It's incredible. This dedication to accuracy and detail is evident in every aspect of the book.
Okay, so we've talked about the river, the book's creation, its potential. What else can we uncover from this presentation?
Let's shift gears to the book's impact on the community.
Yeah, I'm curious how people are actually using this book. Are families reading it together? Are schools incorporating it into their curriculum?
Those snippets from the Q&A are really helpful for understanding that real-world impact.
Right, we get to hear directly from people interacting with the book.
Remember that listener who suggested turning the book into a workshop?
Oh, right. The one about creating personalized versions of the book?
Yeah, that's one example of how this book is sparking creativity and engagement.
It's not just about passive reading. It's prompting people to do something.
And there was that other listener who was asking about permits and safety regulations. They're thinking practically about exploring the river.
Exactly. It's inspiring action. Did they mention any other ways the book is being used?
There was a comment from a teacher who was using it in her classroom.
Oh, that's great. It's finding its way into schools.
She said the kids were totally captivated by the story and eager to learn more.
It's great to hear that. Did she say anything about what she was doing with the book? Any activities?
She mentioned the students were making their own maps of the river.
Oh, wow. I love that. They're highlighting those landmarks and features.
Yeah, it brings the book to life. They're actively engaging with the information.
It's so inspiring to see the creative ways this book is being used. It's a reminder that education can be fun when you use storytelling and visuals.
This book is proof of that. And it raises the question, how did the creators translate those complex scientific concepts for young learners?
Right. We talked about the analogies, but were there any other techniques they used?
Professor Min said it was all about finding the right balance. They spent a lot of time thinking about which details were crucial and which ones could be left out without sacrificing accuracy.
It's about being selective without oversimplifying.
Right. They didn't want to dumb things down, but they also didn't want to overwhelm the kids.
It's a fine line to walk. Did they give any specific examples?
Not really, but they did emphasize the importance of visuals and clear language. They wanted it to be easy to understand, even for kids who aren't strong readers yet.
So it caters to different learning styles. That's smart.
And remember, this was a collaboration. Professor Min with her expertise in children's lit, and Professor Chen with his knowledge of the river.
That blend of expertise is what makes this book so special. It's not just a science book or a storybook, it's both.
And it shows what can happen when people collaborate. They created something that can inspire generations of young learners.
This deep dive has been incredible. I'm seeing the Tamsui River in a whole new light now.
It's more than just a pretty river, it's a living classroom.
Filled with history, ecology, and adventure.
And this book is the perfect guide for exploring it all.
It's a reminder that learning should be joyful and exciting. So what are the key takeaways from this presentation for our listener?
I think the biggest takeaway is that creativity can change the way we learn and engage with the world around us.
This book is a perfect example of that.
It shows us that even simple projects can have a big impact.
It's about sparking curiosity, inspiring action, and getting people to appreciate their surroundings.
As we wrap up, I'm curious, what stood out to you the most from our exploration? What will you take away from this?
For me, it's that education doesn't have to be boring. This book proves that you can teach about ecology and history in a fun, engaging way.
I agree. Learning should be a joyful experience.
And it's never too late to start exploring and discovering new things.
That's a great thought to leave our listeners with. Go out there and explore.
And who knows, maybe you'll be inspired to create something amazing yourself.
Perfect ending.
You know, we've talked a lot about this book and the Tamsui River.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
From those tricky sandbars to the book's impact on the community.
It's been quite a journey.
But there's one thing I keep coming back to.
What's that?
How do they actually make learning about the river fun?
Ah, you're talking about that engaging aspect.
Exactly. It's more than just facts and figures, right?
Right. Professor Min talked about how they approached the language. They wanted to make it really vivid and immersive, almost like you're right there on the river.
So like you can feel the experience through the words?
Exactly. They used a lot of sensory details.
Engaging the reader's imagination.
Like describing the sounds of the water.
Yeah.
You know, lapping against the kayak.
Or the feel of the sun on your skin.
Yes. Or even the salty smell of the air. You can almost taste it.
It makes me think of those nature documentaries, the ones with stunning visual.
Oh, totally. And the narration just pulls you right in.
Like you're actually there experiencing it firsthand.
Exactly. It's like they took that immersive style and applied it to this children's book.
That's a cool way to think about it. Did they give any specific examples of how they did that?
Professor Min mentioned describing the feeling of paddling.
Okay, yeah. Instead of just saying they paddled the kayak.
Right. It was more like Shui dug her paddle into the cool water, feeling the resistance as she pulled it back, propelling the kayak forward with each stroke.
Wow, yeah. That paints such a vivid picture.
You can practically feel the effort and the movement of the water.
It's like you're in the kayak with her.
Exactly. And that's the whole point. They want the reader to feel like they're part of the adventure.
Not just reading about it, but experiencing it.
Speaking of experiencing it, Professor Chin brought up those exposed sandbars again.
The ones that can be tricky for kayakers.
Yeah, but he pointed out they're not just hazards, they're actually unique ecological zones.
Really? I wouldn't have thought of that.
They're teeming with life.
Oh, wow. What kind of life?
He mentioned things like mudskippers and fiddler crabs. Those creatures that are adapted to living between the water and the land.
So like a hidden world that you only see at low tide.
Exactly. The book uses those sandbars as opportunities for discovery.
Encouraging kids to explore those micro-ecosystems.
It's like those nature shows where they zoom in on a tiny area and you see this whole universe unfolding.
Right, things you never even knew existed.
Exactly. And this book does that with the Tamsui River. It takes something that could be a problem and turns it into a learning experience.
As we talk about this, I'm really struck by how every little detail in this book seems intentional. It's all carefully designed to create this rich learning experience.
It's like they thought of everything, from the characters to the setting to the language.
And one of the most exciting things is its potential to impact the wider community.
Absolutely. We heard from teachers, parents, even tourism professionals.
They're all excited about the possibilities. It's inspiring people to see the Danshui in a new way.
Remember those workshop ideas where people could create their own versions of the book?
Yeah. That's a great example of how this book is encouraging creativity and action.
It's not just a story, it's a catalyst for change.
Do they talk about any other ways the book could be used besides those workshops?
Professor Chen mentioned they're actually working with local tour operators to develop kayaking tours based on the book.
No way. That's amazing, taking the story from the page to the river.
Exactly. And it's a great way to boost ecotourism, to get people out there exploring the river responsibly.
So this book is having a ripple effect, influencing education and tourism in the region.
It's a powerful example of how creativity can lead to real-world change.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm just amazed by the passion behind this project. It's inspiring to see how they took a simple children's book and turned it into something so impactful.
It's a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference,
whether it's through art, science, or sharing our love for the world around us.
So for our listener who's been with us on this journey, what's the one thing you'll take away from our exploration?
What will stick with you?
Maybe it's a newfound appreciation for the power of storytelling.
Or maybe it's sparked an idea for your own creative adventure.
Whatever it may be, we hope this deep dive has left you feeling curious and inspired.
Ready to explore the world with fresh eyes. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Danshui River. Until next time.